The bustling port of Tortuga had seen many strange sights, but nothing quite like the spectacle unfolding near the fish market. A small monkey lay dying in the dirt, its tiny chest barely rising and falling as crowds of merchants, healers and seasoned sailors gathered around. Each claimed they knew exactly why the creature couldn't be saved, too sick, too far gone, simply not worth the effort. Then came Captain Jonas Blackwater, a weathered pirate whose pockets held nothing but lint and whose ship carried more patches than original wood. While others debated the monkey's fate, Jonas knelt down and gently lifted the trembling animal into his calloused hands. What happened next would become the stuff of legend throughout the Caribbean. But how could a man with nothing to give succeed where everyone else had failed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crowd parted reluctantly as Jonas Blackwater rose from the dusty ground, the dying monkey cradled against his chest like precious cargo. His weathered face, marked by 45 years of sun and salt spray, showed a tenderness that seemed out of place among the hardened souls of Tortuga's harbor. "You're wasting your time, Blackwater," sneered Cornelius Drake, a fat merchant whose gold-toothed smile never reached his calculating eyes. "That vermin's half dead already. Better to put it out of its misery." Jonas didn't acknowledge the merchant's word. Instead, he focused on the tiny heartbeat fluttering against his palm, weak but persistent. The monkey's fur, once probably a rich brown, had dulled to the color of old leather, matted with sweat and grime. Its breathing came in shallow gasps that seemed to echo the rhythm of waves against his ship's hull. "Captain," called a voice from behind him. Isabella Santos, his quartermaster and the closest thing to family he'd known in 20 years, approached with careful steps. Her dark hair was braided back from a face that had seen too much hardship for her 38 years. But her eyes held the same compassionate fire that had drawn her to Jonas's crew 3 years ago. "The tide's turning. We should get back to the Mercy's End." Jonas nodded, but his attention remained fixed on the creature in his arms. Something about its condition reminded him of another soul he'd once found broken and abandoned himself. 12 years ago, after losing everything in Hurricane Sophia, his merchant vessel, his cargo, his crew, all claimed by winds that showed no mercy to the ambitious or the careful. The Mercy's End bobbed at anchor beyond the harbor's edge, her patched sails furled like the wings of a sleeping bird. She wasn't much to look at. Her hull bore the scars of countless storms, her rigging held together with rope that had seen better decades, and her crew quarters leaked when the weather turned rough. But she was home to 16 souls who had nowhere else to go. "What's that you got there, Captain?" Old Oat emerged from the crowd, his wooden leg tapping a familiar rhythm against the cobblestones. The ship's cook and unofficial medical officer, Pete, had lost his leg to a Spanish cannonball 15 years ago, and his faith in traditional piracy shortly after joining Jonas's crew. His grizzled face creased with concern as he peered at the monkey. "A patient," Jonas replied simply, adjusting his hold to better support the creature's head. The monkey's eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing brown orbs, dulled by fever, but still holding a spark of awareness. For a moment, Jonas felt an almost electric connection, as if the animal recognized something in him. "Looks bad," Pete observed, running practiced fingers along the monkey's limbs. "Fever, dehydration, probably hasn't eaten in days." "What made you pick this one up, Captain?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment, remembering his own desperate nights, sleeping in doorways, scrounging for scraps, before Isabella found him and convinced him that sometimes the broken could help heal the broken. Because nobody else would. The walk to their longboat took them past the usual collection of Caribbean port life. Rum-soaked sailors trading impossible stories, merchants hawking everything from stolen Spanish silver to questionable remedies for the pox, and the ever-present smell of fish, sweat, and adventure. But Jonas noticed none of it. His world had narrowed to the rettle life in his arms. As they rowed toward the Mercy's End, Isabella studied her captain's face. She'd seen him rescue plenty of strays over the years, Miguel, who'd been left for dead after a tavern brawl, Sarah, the girl who'd stowed away to escape an arranged marriage to a cruel planter, even old Pete himself, who'd been drinking himself to death in a Port Royal gutter when Jonas offered him a purpose. "You know the crew's going to have questions," Isabella said quietly, her oars cutting through water that reflected the late afternoon sun like scattered coins. "They always do," Jonas replied, "and they always come around eventually." The monkey stirred slightly, its tiny hand grasping weakly at Jonas's shirt. The gesture was so human, so desperate, that it sent an unexpected surge of determination through the captain. This creature would not die on his watch. Not if love and stubborn refusal to give up counted for anything. As they approached the Mercy's End, Jonas pulled out his tattered logbook from his coat pocket. Its leather cover was cracked and stained with salt water, filled with entries documenting every soul he'd tried to save over the year. Some entries ended in triumph, others in heartbreak, but all were written in the same careful hand that had once kept merchant ledgers. Tonight, he would add another name to those pages, and tomorrow he would begin the work of proving that sometimes, when everything else fails, love is enough. The Mercy's End rocked gently as Jonas climbed aboard, the monkey still pressed against his chest. Word of their captain's newest rescue had already spread among the crew, and curious faces peered from the rigging and deck. Some wore expressions of fond exasperation. They'd seen this pattern before, while others looked skeptical about adding another mouth to feed when their supplies were already stretched thin. "Another stray," called out Miguel Santos, Isabella's younger brother, from where he was mending a torn sail. At 19, he still carried the optimism that his sister had learned to temper with experience. "What is it this time?" "Monkey," Jonas replied, carefully making his way toward his cabin. "And he's dying." A collective groan rose from several crew members. Thomas Hartwell, the ship's navigator and former Royal Navy officer who'd joined them after a court-martial over refusing to fire on civilian vessels, shook his head disapprovingly. "Captain, with respect, we barely have enough medicine for the crew, and our food stores won't last another week if we don't take a prize soon." Jonas paused at his cabin door, turning to face his assembled crew. These men and women had followed him through storms and battles, trusting his judgment even when it seemed to defy common sense. He owed them honesty, even if he couldn't always give them certainty. "I know times are hard," he said, his voice carrying across the deck. "I know we've all made sacrifices, but look around you, every one of us was once considered not worth saving. Miguel, you were a street thief facing the gallows. Sarah, you were trapped in a life that would have killed your spirit. Thomas, the Navy threw you away for having a conscience." He gestured toward the monkey, whose breathing had become more labored during the journey from shore. "This little fellow deserves the same chance we all got. The same chance to prove that broken doesn't mean worthless." Sarah Kellens, the former planter's daughter, who'd cut her hair short and learned to handle a cutlass with deadly precision, stepped forward. Her green eyes, still soft despite 3 years of pirate life, studied the monkey with a healer's instinct. "Let me see him, Captain." Jonas carefully transferred the creature to Sarah's experienced hands. She'd learned battlefield medicine during their raids on Spanish slave ships, patching up freed slaves and crew members alike. Her touch was gentle but thorough as she examined the monkey's condition. "Severe dehydration," she murmured, feeling along the animal's ribs. "Fever's burning him up from the inside. And look here," she parted the matted fur on the monkey's shoulder, revealing an infected wound. "Something bit him maybe days ago. Poison spreading through his system." "Can you help him?" Jonas asked. Sarah looked uncertain. "I can try, but I'll need to use some of our medical supplies. Clean bandages, what's left of the rum for disinfectant, maybe some of old Pete's herbs." A murmur of discontent rippled through some of the crew. Bandages and rum were precious commodities that might mean the difference between life and death for human crew members in their next engagement. "Use whatever you need," Jonas said firmly. Captain Thomas began to protest, but Isabella cut him off. The captain's made his decision. That's the end of it. As Sarah carried the monkey toward the ship's makeshift infirmary, Jonas noticed young Billy Thompson watching from the shadows near the mainmast. At 14, Billy was the youngest member of their crew, an orphan they'd found half-starved in Jamaica 2 years ago. The boy's eyes followed the monkey with an expression Jonas recognized, the look of someone who understood what it meant to be discarded by the world. "You want to help, Billy?" Jonas asked. The boy nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir, I could sit with him, make sure he don't fall or nothing." "Good lad. Sarah will tell you what needs doing." As the crew dispersed to their various duties, Jonas found himself alone at the ship's rail, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The monkey's labored breathing echoed in his memory, reminding him of his own desperate nights after the hurricane, when death seemed preferable to the crushing weight of failure and loss. Isabella joined him at the rail, her presence both comforting and challenging as always. "You know they're starting to question your judgment," she said quietly. "They always do when I bring someone new aboard. This is different, Jonas. We haven't taken a decent prize in 2 months. The crew's getting rested, and now you're using our medical supplies on an animal that might not survive the night." Jonas was quiet for a long moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small piece of torn fabric, part of Isabella's own dress, which she'd wordlessly offered when Sarah needed clean bandages for the monkey. "Thank you," he said simply. Isabella looked down at the fabric, then back at her captain. "You really think this little creature is worth the risk?" "I think every life is worth the risk. Even the smallest ones, especially the smallest ones." As night fell over the Caribbean, the Mersey's end settled into the rhythm of evening watch. Below deck, Sarah worked tirelessly to save the monkey while Billy kept vigil, and Jonas stood at his cabin window, wondering if love and determination would be enough this time. 3 days passed like a held breath. The monkey, whom Billy had taken to calling Hope, despite Jonas's protests that naming him would make it harder if things went badly, grew stronger with each passing hour. By the 2nd day, he was taking water from a makeshift dropper. By the 3rd, he was sitting up and watching the crew's activities with bright, curious eyes. Jonas carved a small wooden whistle during the evening watch, his weathered hands working the soft pine with the same patience he'd once used to teach young sailors how to read the stars. It was a simple thing, barely more than a hollow tube with holes punched through it, but when he offered it to the monkey, those small fingers grasped it immediately. "Look at that," Billy whispered in amazement. "He knows what it is." The monkey brought the whistle to his lips and produced a soft, melodic note that seemed to carry across the water like a prayer. Several crew members stopped their work to listen, and Jonas felt something shift in the atmosphere aboard the Mersey's end. The skepticism that had greeted their newest passenger was gradually giving way to something else, acceptance perhaps, or even affection. "Time to visit Mama Esperanza," Jonas announced as the sun reached its zenith on the 3rd day. The journey to the North Shore settlement took them through waters Jonas knew well, past hidden coves where he'd once helped liberate cargo from Spanish treasure galleons, but those days of traditional piracy felt distant now, like memories from someone else's life. The monkey sat on his shoulder during the boat ride, occasionally playing soft notes on his wooden whistle, as if announcing their arrival to the sea itself. Mama Esperanza's hut stood apart from the other buildings, surrounded by gardens that seemed to grow with impossible abundance, despite the sandy soil. Plants Jonas didn't recognize flourished alongside familiar herbs, their leaves rustling with secrets older than the European presence in the Caribbean. "You came," the old woman said, emerging from her doorway before they'd even beached their longboat. "And you brought it." The monkey leaped from Jonas's shoulder to Mama Esperanza's outstretched arm with surprising agility. She studied him closely, making soft clicking sounds that he seemed to understand and respond to. "His strength has returned," she observed. "But more than that, he trusts you completely. See how he looks to her too, even while in my arms? That bond I spoke of, it has deepened." She led them inside her hut, where dried herbs hung from every rafter, and the air shimmered with scents that made Jonas think of distant places he'd never seen. The monkey immediately began exploring, his movements confident and purposeful rather than the random wandering of an ordinary animal. "You want to know where he came from?" Mama Esperanza said, settling into a chair woven from what looked like seagrass. "And why those ancient herbs were in his system?" Jonas nodded. "There are islands in these waters that don't appear on any Spanish map," she began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who had told this story many times but never to ears that would truly understand. "Islands that existed before the conquistadors came, before even my people learned to read the stars for navigation." The monkey had found a collection of small objects on a shelf, shells, stones, pieces of carved wood, and was arranging them in a pattern that seemed meaningful to him, though Jonas couldn't decipher its significance. Long ago, these islands were home to creatures that bridged the gap between animal and spirit. They served as guardians, protectors of knowledge that the world wasn't ready to lose, but wasn't yet ready to fully understand. She gestured toward the monkey, who had finished his arrangement and was now playing soft, complex melodies on his wooden whistle. The sound seemed to make the very air in the hut vibrate with harmonics. Jonas could feel in his bones. This little one carries the blood of those guardians. Not much. His ancestors mixed with common monkeys generations ago, but enough to make him special. Enough to make him seek out someone whose heart was open to impossible things. Jonas felt his world tilting on its axis. "You're saying he chose me? I'm saying he recognized something in you that even you don't fully understand yet. The question is, what are you going to do with that recognition?" The monkey finished his song and leaped back to Jonas's shoulder, pressing his small, warm body against the captain's neck in a gesture of complete trust. Jonas reached up to stroke the creature's fur, marveling at how something so small could carry so much mystery. "What would you have me do?" Mama Esperanza smiled, revealing teeth stained by decades of chewing medicinal roots. "The same thing you've always done, Captain Blackwater. Follow your heart, even when your head tells you it's foolish. But understand that this little guardian will test that heart in ways you cannot imagine." As they prepared to leave, the monkey carefully gathered the objects he'd arranged, tucking them into a small pouch Jonas hadn't noticed before. Mama Esperanza watched this with approval. "He's choosing to stay with you," she explained, "but he's also keeping part of his heritage with him. Those objects are sacred to his kind, keys to knowledge that might prove important someday." The journey back to the Mercy's End was peaceful, the monkey content on Jonas's shoulder, occasionally playing gentle melodies that seemed to calm the very waters around their boat. The return to Tortuga's bustling port brought unwelcome attention. Word of the monkey's miraculous recovery had spread through the Caribbean's gossip networks faster than news of a Spanish treasure fleet, and Jonas found himself the center of curious stares and whispered conversations as he walked through the market square. The monkey Hope, as the crew had unanimously decided to call him, despite Jonas's earlier reservations, rode on his shoulder with regal bearing, occasionally responding to the crowd's attention with melodic trills from his wooden whistle. The sound seemed to enchant some listeners while making others inexplicably nervous. "Well, well," came a familiar voice dripping with mock surprise. "If it isn't the famous monkey Dr. Cornelius Drake," stepped from behind a spice merchant's stall, his gold-toothed smile glinting in the afternoon sun. The fat merchant was flanked by two associates Jonas didn't recognize, hard men with the look of hired muscle about them. "Cornelius," Jonas acknowledged with a slight nod. "Gentlemen, amazing thing what you did with that diseased little beast," Drake continued, his eyes fixed greedily on Hope. "Truly miraculous. I've been thinking about that miracle quite a lot, actually." Hope shifted uncomfortably on Jonas's shoulder, producing a low, warning trill that raised the hair on the captain's arms. The monkey's small body had tensed, and Jonas could feel alertness radiating from the creature like heat from a forge. "Have you now?" "Indeed, you see, I've had inquiries from certain collectors, wealthy men who appreciate unique specimens. Men who would pay handsomely for a monkey that can apparently return from death's door." Drake's smile widened, revealing more gold than tooth. "I'm prepared to offer you 500 pieces of 8. More money than your leaky bucket of a ship will see in 3 years of honest work." The number was staggering. 500 pieces of 8 could buy the Mersey's End proper repairs, enough supplies to last through hurricane season, and medicine for the crew. It represented security, comfort, everything his people needed and deserved. "He's not for sale," Jonas said quietly. Drake's expression shifted, the false friendliness melting away like wax in flame. "Everything is for sale, Blackwater. It's just a matter of finding the right price." He pulled out an ornate compass, its case made of gleaming gold and inlaid with precious stones. The artifact caught the sunlight and threw it back in dazzling patterns that drew the attention of everyone nearby. Jonas recognized it as more than just a navigation tool. It was a symbol of wealth, status, and the kind of power that money could buy. 1,000 pieces of 8, Drake said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet market square. "Final offer." The silence stretched like a taut rope. Jonas was aware of Isabella moving closer to his right side, her hand resting casually on her cutlass hilt. Old Pete had positioned himself to cover their retreat toward the harbor. The crew knew their captain well enough to sense trouble brewing. Hope's whistle song changed, becoming something deeper and more complex. The melody seemed to reach into Jonas's chest and remind him of every reason he'd picked up a dying creature from the dirt 3 days ago. It spoke of compassion over calculation, of love over profit, of the value of things that couldn't be measured in gold. "I said he's not for sale," Jonas repeated, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded merchant vessels across the Atlantic. Drake's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, Blackwater. A very expensive mistake. Wouldn't be my first. No, but it might be your last." Drake stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over Jonas and Hope. "You think your reputation as the soft-hearted pirate protects you? You think people won't talk about the fool who chose a monkey over a fortune?" Hope's song stopped abruptly. The monkey leaped from Jonas's shoulder to a nearby market stall, then to the top of a barrel, putting himself between Jonas and Drake. Despite his small size, there was something unmistakably protective in his stance. "Fascinating," Drake murmured, his greedy eyes tracking Hope's movements. "It really does understand, doesn't it? That makes it even more valuable. The only thing valuable here is knowing when to walk away," Isabella said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that had made her reputation in 3 years of pirate warfare. Drake glanced at her, then at the growing crowd of onlookers, many of whom seemed to be silently taking sides in the confrontation. Jonas realized that this moment was about more than hope. It was about what kind of man he chose to be when tested by temptation. "Keep your gold, Cornelius," Jonas said, reaching out so Hope could leap back to his shoulder. "Some things aren't for sale at any price." The monkey's whistle resumed its gentle melody as Jonas turned and walked away, his crew falling into protective formation around him. Behind them, Drake's voice carried across the market square like a curse. "This isn't over, Blackwater. No one turns down that kind of money and walks away unscathed." But Jonas was already focused on the future, on getting his crew safely back to the Mersey's End, and on the strange comfort of Hope's music filling the air around them like a shield made of sound. Within a week, Jonas couldn't enter a tavern without hearing some version of his story being told. The tale grew with each retelling, as such stories do, until Hope had supposedly been brought back from actual death rather than mere near-death, and Jonas had performed the miracle through prayer, magic, or sheer force of will, depending on who was doing the telling. At the Salty Dog Tavern on Nassau, Jonas watched from a corner table as a one-eyed storyteller held court near the bar. The man wore a battered tricorn hat that had seen better decades, and he gestured dramatically as he spun his version of events. "I tell you, mates, I seen it with me own eyes," the storyteller declared, though Jonas was certain they'd never met. "That monkey was stiff as a board, flies buzzing around its head, when Captain Blackwater picked it up. And you know what he did? He breathed life right back into it. He did." The assembled crowd of sailors, merchants, and ne'er-do-wells murmured appreciatively. Hope, perched on Jonas's shoulder, watched the performance with what appeared to be amusement, occasionally adding soft whistle notes. that seemed to encourage the storyteller's embellishment. But that ain't the strangest part, the man continued, removing his hat and holding it out for coins. The strangest part is what happened after. They say that monkey can sense storms, 3 days out can find fresh water on a desert island, and knows which way the wind will blow before the wind knows itself. More coins clinked into the hat. Jonas sipped his rum and wondered how much of the storyteller's claims might actually be true. Hope had indeed shown an uncanny ability to predict weather changes, and twice on their journey to Nassau, the monkey had guided them to hidden freshwater springs on supposedly barren islands. Captain Blackwater, a young voice called from across the tavern. Boy of perhaps 16 approached their table, his eyes bright with excitement and something that might have been desperation. "Sir, I heard about what you did, about how you saved that monkey when everyone else said it couldn't be done." Jonas gestured for the boy to sit. Up close he could see the telltale signs of hard-living clothes that had been mended too many times, the hollow-cheeked look of someone who didn't get enough to eat, and most telling of all, the careful way he moved that suggested recent injury. "What's your name, lad?" "Timothy Marsh, sir."
"I'm from Port Royal, originally.
The boy hesitated, then reached into a canvas bag at his feet. "I brought something, someone who needs help." He carefully lifted out a small parrot with a broken wing. The bird's bright green feathers were dulled with pain and exhaustion, and it hung limp in Timothy's gentle grasp. "Found her after a fight with some Spanish sailors," Timothy explained. "They were using her for target practice. I chased them off, but she's hurt bad. The local healers say there's nothing to be done. Her wing's too damaged, and birds don't heal like people do." Hope immediately leaped from Jonas's shoulder to the table, approaching the injured parrot with careful, deliberate movements. The bird's eyes tracked the monkey's approach with surprising alertness. "I don't have any money," Timothy continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But I heard you don't care about that. I heard you help creatures that nobody else will help." Jonas looked around the tavern and realized that the storyteller had stopped his performance. Every patron was watching their table now, waiting to see if the legend would live up to the reality. "What makes you think I can help when trained healers cannot?" Timothy's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. "Because you're the only one who tried." Hope began playing a soft melody on his wooden whistle, and the parrot's head lifted slightly, as if the music carried some healing quality. Jonas found himself thinking of all the creatures he'd failed to save over the years. The injured sea turtle that died despite his efforts, the wounded seagull that never flew again, the dozens of small tragedies that haunted his quieter moments. But he also thought of the successes. Hope himself, obviously, but also the ship's cat, who'd recovered from poisoning, the dolphin they'd freed from Spanish fishing nets, and the countless human souls who'd found new life aboard the Mercy's End. "I can't promise miracles," Jonas said finally, "but I can promise we'll try." The relief on Timothy's face was immediate and profound. Hope continued his whistle song, while Jonas carefully examined the parrot's wing, his weathered hands gentle despite their strength. "We'll need to get her back to the ship," he decided. "Sarah knows more about treating birds than I do." As they prepared to leave, the one-eyed storyteller approached their table, his hat still in his hand but no longer seeking coins. "Captain," he said quietly, "would you mind if I told this story too, about the boy and the bird?" Jonas considered the question seriously. These stories were spreading his reputation in ways that might bring both help and trouble. "Tell it true," he said finally. "Don't make it more than it was, and don't make promises I can't keep." The storyteller nodded solemnly, then placed his battered hat on his head, with the reverence of a man donning a crown. The storm struck without warning on their third day out from Nassau. One moment the Caribbean stretched before them like hammered silver, the next moment the sky had turned the color of old blood, and winds were shrieking through the rigging with voices that sounded almost human. "All hands on deck," Jonas bellowed over the howling wind. "Secure everything that moves." The Mercy's End bucked like a wild horse as waves tall as cathedral spires crashed over her bow. Thomas Hartwell fought the wheel, while Jonas and his crew battled to keep their ship afloat in waters that seemed determined to claim them. Hope clung to Jonas's shoulder throughout the ordeal, his small body pressed tight against the captain's neck. But instead of cowering in fear, the monkey was playing his wooden whistle, a haunting melody that somehow cut through the storm's roar and reached every member of the crew. The mainmast, Sarah screamed, pointing upward. John has looked up to see a sight that stopped his heart. A massive bolt of lightning had struck their mainmast, splitting it nearly in half. The upper portion swayed dangerously, held in place by increasingly strained rigging that groaned with each gust of wind. If that falls, it'll take half the rigging with it. Thomas called from the wheel, "We'll be dead in the water." Miguel was already moving, scrambling up the ratlines with a coil of rope despite the ship's violent pitching. But the wind caught him halfway up, slamming him against the mast with a sickening crack. "Miguel!" Isabella's scream cut through the storm. Her brother clung to the rigging, obviously injured, unable to continue climbing. The split mast groaned ominously above him, and everyone could see it was only moments from complete failure. Hope's whistle song suddenly changed, becoming more urgent, more insistent. The monkey leaped from Jonas's shoulder and began scrambling up the rigging with impossible speed and agility, his small size allowing him to navigate the swaying ropes where larger crew members would be thrown to their deaths. "What's he doing?" Billy shouted over the wind. Jonas watched in amazement as Hope reached Miguel's position, then continued climbing toward the damaged mast. The monkey seemed to know exactly what needed to be done. He began working the rigging in a way that redistributed the stress, using his small but nimble fingers to retie crucial knots and redirect the load-bearing ropes. "He's jury-rigging the mast," Old Pete called out, his voice filled with wonder. "Look at him work." But the storm wasn't finished with them. Another massive wave crashed over the ship, and Jonas felt the Mercy's End shudder, as if struck by a giant's fist. The lightning-split mast finally gave way, its upper section beginning to fall directly toward where Hope was working. Time seemed to slow. Jonas could see the massive wooden beam plummeting downward, could see Hope's small form silhouetted against the storm-dark sky, could see that there was no possible way for the monkey to escape in time. "Hope!" Jonas's voice carried across the water like a prayer. At the last possible second, Hope's whistle song reached a crescendo that seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of the storm. The falling mast twisted slightly, just enough for the monkey to swing clear on a loose rope, landing safely on a lower yard arm. But Hope's heroics weren't finished. From his new position, he could see something the crew on deck could not. A massive reef, dead ahead, hidden beneath the storm-churned waters. His whistle song changed again, becoming a series of sharp, urgent notes that somehow conveyed both warning and direction. "He's trying to tell us something," Jonas realized. Thomas followed the monkey's gestures and saw the danger just in time. "Reef to starboard. Hard a port." The ship groaned as Thomas spun the wheel, bringing them around just as the storm surge would have driven them onto the jagged coral. Hope's warning had saved them from certain destruction. As quickly as it had come, the storm began to subside. The winds died to a manageable howl. The waves settled from mountainous to merely intimidating, and the crew of the Mercy's End found themselves still alive, still afloat, and still together. Hope descended from the rigging, as calmly as if he'd been taking an afternoon stroll, pausing only to check on Miguel's injuries before returning to Jonas's shoulder. The split mast stood secure in its jury-rigged harness, a testament to the monkey's uncanny understanding of seamanship. "I've never seen anything like it," Thomas said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "That monkey saved the ship, saved all of us." Isabella helped her injured brother below deck, while the rest of the crew began assessing the storm damage. Despite the terror of the past few hours, spirits were surprisingly high. They had faced nature's fury and survived, and they all knew who deserved the credit. "That was no ordinary storm," Old Pete observed, studying the retreating clouds with a sailor's experienced eye. "Came out of nowhere, struck like the devil's own fist, then vanished. almost like something was testing us. Hope's soft whistle melody drifted across the deck as the Caribbean sun broke through the dissipating clouds, and Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that Pete was right. They had been tested, and somehow, impossibly, they had passed. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after the storm. Jonas had just finished his morning inspection of the jury-rigged mast when the lookout's cry shattered the peaceful Caribbean morning. "Sail ho, 3 points off the starboard bow." Jonas raised his spyglass and felt his blood chill. The approaching vessel flew the black flag of Captain Rodrigo, the butcher Mendez, whose reputation for cruelty was legendary even among the Brotherhood of the Coast. The ship was the Venganza, a captured Spanish war galleon, bristling with cannons and crewed by men who showed no mercy to anyone, pirate or civilian alike. "Battle stations," Jonas commanded, though he knew the Mercy's end was no match for Rodrigo's superior firepower. Hope, sensing the tension, climbed higher on Jonas's shoulder and began playing a low, warning trill on his wooden whistle. The melody was different from his usual songs, darker, more urgent, as if the music itself carried the scent of approaching violence. The Venganza closed the distance with predatory grace, her black hull cutting through the waves like a shark moving in for the kill. When she came within hailing distance, a familiar voice boomed across the water. Jonas Blackwater, the famous monkey savior. Captain Rodrigo Mendez stood at his ship's rail, a mountain of a man with arms covered in tattoos that told the story of every ship he'd taken, every enemy he'd killed. His most distinctive feature was a blood-stained cutlass that hung at his side, a blade said to have never been cleaned since his first kill 20 years ago. "Rodrigo," Jonas called back. "What brings you to these waters?" "You do, hermano. Word has spread about your little miracle worker. They say you've gone soft, choosing monkeys over gold, healing over hunting." Rodrigo's laugh was like the sound of grinding millstones. "I've come to see if the great Jonas Blackwater still remembers how to be a pirate." 2 longboats were already being lowered from the Venganza, filled with armed men whose scarred faces spoke of countless battles. Jonas realized this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. "What do you want, Rodrigo?" "A test. The old ways against the new. You've forgotten what it means to be feared, to take what you want by force. I'm here to remind you." The boarding party reached the Mercy's end with practiced efficiency. Rodrigo himself climbed aboard, his massive frame dwarfing everyone else on deck. His eyes immediately fixed on Hope, who had stopped playing his whistle and was watching the intruders with unmistakable hostility. "So this is the famous miracle monkey," Rodrigo mused, stepping closer. "Doesn't look like much. I've heard it can predict storms, find treasure, even bring the dead back to life. Impressive stories for such a small creature. Stories have a way of growing in the telling." Jonas replied carefully, "Indeed they do, which is why I propose a simple test." Rodrigo drew his blood-stained cutlass, the metal gleaming dully in the morning sun. "If your monkey is truly special, let's see him save you from this." The blade moved faster than Jonas could react, slicing toward his chest with deadly precision. But Hope was faster still. The monkey leaped from Jonas's shoulder, swinging on a loose rope, to kick Rodrigo's wrist just as the cutlass completed its arc. The blade missed Jonas by inches, embedding itself in the mainmast. Rodrigo stared in amazement as Hope landed gracefully on a nearby barrel, his whistle producing a sound that was almost like mocking laughter. "Impossible," Rodrigo breathed. "No animal moves that fast." "Hope's full of surprises," Jonas said, his heart still racing from the near-death experience. "Hope." Rodrigo's scarred face broke into a savage grin. "You named it Hope. How wonderfully sentimental." He yanked his cutlass from the mast, studying the fresh wood chips on the blade. "But sentiment won't save you from what comes next." He gestured to his men, who immediately surrounded Jonas's crew with drawn weapons. "Here's my test, Blackwater. Choose 3 of your people to fight 3 of mine. Hand-to-hand combat, no weapons, no mercy. If your people win, we sail away and leave you in peace. If mine win," he shrugged expressively, "well, Let's just say your monkey will need to find a new master. And if I refuse, then we take your ship by force, sell your crew to the Spanish, and I keep your miracle monkey as a trophy, your choice." Jonas looked around at his crew, Isabella with her fierce loyalty, old Pete with his wooden leg, Sarah with her healer's hands that had never been trained for violence. None of them were warriors in the traditional sense, but all of them were survivors. "I'll fight for my crew myself," Jonas said. "No," Isabella stepped forward. "This is our fight too. We choose who represents us." Hope's whistle suddenly changed tempo, becoming a rallying song that seemed to fill each crew member with unexpected courage. Miguel, still nursing his injuries from the storm, stepped forward despite his sister's protests. Sarah surprised everyone by volunteering next, her green eyes blazing with determination. Old Pete completed the trio, his wooden leg tapping against the deck like a war drum. Rodrigo's grin widened. "Excellent, my champions are already chosen." He gestured to 3 of his largest men, each one a veteran of countless battles. "May the strongest survive." As Rodrigo's men cleared a fighting circle on the deck, Jonas felt Hope press something small and warm into his palm. Looking down, he saw the monkey had given him a braided rope bracelet, simple hemp fibers woven together with surprising intricacy. The tiny artifact seemed insignificant compared to the violence about to unfold, but Jonas understood its meaning. Hope was offering him a token of their bond, a reminder that some connections transcend fear and circumstance. "First match," Rodrigo announced with the enthusiasm of a man who enjoyed watching others suffer. Miguel Santos against Carlos the Crusher. Carlos stepped into the circle, a bear of a man, whose massive fists had reportedly caved in more skulls than most pirates had seen battles. Scars covered his knuckles like primitive jewelry, and his smile revealed teeth that had been filed points in the Carib fashion. Miguel moved to face him, still favoring his left arm from the storm injuries. The young man looked impossibly small next to his opponent, but Hope's whistle song seemed to give him strength. The melody was subtle, almost subliminal, weaving itself into Miguel's movements like an extra layer of confidence. The fight began with Carlos charging like an enraged bull, his massive fists swinging in haymaker arcs that could have felled trees. But Miguel wasn't there when the punches arrived. Hope's music seemed to guide the young pirate's movements, helping him flow around Carlos's attacks like water around stone. "Impossible," one of Rodrigo's men muttered. "The boy's reading his moves before he makes them." Carlos grew frustrated, his attacks becoming wilder and less controlled. Miguel waited for his moment, then struck with precision rather than power. A series of quick jabs to pressure points that Sarah had taught him during their medical training. The giant toppled like a cut tree, unconscious before he hit the deck. "One for the Mercy's End," Jonas said quietly, slipping Hope's bracelet onto his wrist. Rodrigo's expression had shifted from amusement to genuine interest. "Lucky punch. Let's see how your healer fares against Serpenti was a different kind of dangerous, lean and quick, with a reputation for using poison on his weapons. Even in unarmed combat, his fingernails had been sharpened and treated with various toxins. He moved like his namesake, coiled and ready to strike. Sarah entered the circle with calm determination. She'd spent 3 years patching up the wounded from pirate battles, and she understood violence in ways that went beyond mere fighting technique. When Serpente struck, she was ready. The fight was a dance of near misses and calculated risks. Serpente's poisoned nails whistled through the air where Sarah's face had been an instant before. But the healer had advantages her opponent didn't expect. She knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum pain with minimum effort, and she understood the human body's vulnerabilities in ways that no traditional fighter could match. When Serpente overextended himself on a particularly vicious swipe, Sarah stepped inside his guard and pressed specific points along his neck and shoulder. The pirate collapsed instantly, paralyzed by pressure point techniques she'd learned while treating stroke victims. To Isabella said with quiet pride. Rodrigo was no longer smiling. Tomás El Martillo will finish this nonsense. The final opponent was the worst of the three, a man who had earned his nickname the Hammer by preferring to beat his enemies to death with his bare fists, rather than using quicker, cleaner methods. His hands were wrapped in leather strips that had been hardened with repeated soaking in blood and salt water. Old Pete limped into the circle, his wooden leg creating an uneven rhythm on the deck planking. At first glance, he seemed hopelessly outmatched, an aging cook with a disability against a killer in his prime. But Pete had been a pirate longer than anyone else aboard either ship. He'd survived battles that had claimed stronger, faster men by learning to use his brain instead of relying on brute force. And unlike his younger crewmates, Pete fought dirty. The match began with Tomás trying to get close enough to use his devastating punches. Pete kept him at bay with his wooden leg, using it like a club to block and counter-attack. Hope's whistle song had changed again, becoming something that sounded almost like laughter, as if the monkey found Pete's unorthodox fighting style amusing. When Tomás finally managed to grab Pete's shirt and pull him close for a killing blow, the old cook was ready. He'd been holding a handful of the cook's pepper blend in his free hand, and he threw it directly into Tomás's eyes at point-blank range. The giant pirate screamed and staggered backward, clawing at his burning eyes. Pete followed up with a series of strikes from his wooden leg, methodically dropping his opponent with the calm efficiency of someone who had survived too many fights to take chances. 3 for 3, Jonas announced as Tomás collapsed. The deck fell silent except for Hope's triumphant whistle melody. Rodrigo stared at his fallen champions with an expression of pure bipia. "This is impossible," he said finally. "My men are the finest fighters in the Caribbean. They don't lose to cooks and healers and injured boys. Maybe that's because you've been measuring the wrong things," Jonas replied, fingering the rope bracelet on his wrist. "Strength isn't always about size. Sometimes it's about heart." Hope's song reached a crescendo that seemed to celebrate not just victory, but the vindication of everything Jonas had tried to build with his crew. They had proven that compassion and cleverness could triumph over cruelty and brute force. But Jonas could see that Rodrigo wasn't finished with them yet. Rodrigo's defeat should have been the end of it. But as his men helped the unconscious champions back to their longboats, the massive pirate captain lingered on deck. His eyes kept drifting to Hope, who sat contentedly on Jonas's shoulder, occasionally playing soft victory melodies on his wooden whistle. "You've surprised me today, Blackwater," Rodrigo admitted, his voice carrying a grudging respect that Jonas had never heard before. "Your crew fights with honor, and your monkey—" He paused, studying Hope with new interest. "There's something different about that creature, something that goes beyond mere intelligence. Hope's special," Jonas agreed carefully. "Indeed he is. Which is why I have a proposition for you." Rodrigo reached into his coat and produced a rolled parchment sealed with black wax. One last test, not of strength this time, but of courage. Jonas accepted the document with suspicion. The parchment felt old, its edges yellowed with age, and the wax seal bore a symbol he didn't recognize, a stylized tree with roots that seemed to twist into infinity. "What is this?" "A treasure map," Rodrigo replied, but his usual enthusiasm for gold seemed muted. "Found it in the personal effects of a Spanish admiral we relieved of his duties last month. But this isn't ordinary treasure, hermano. This map leads to something the Spanish called La Isla de los Guardianes, the Island of the Guardians." Hope's whistle song stopped abruptly. The monkey's small body tensed, and Jonas felt him grip his shoulder with unusual force. It was as if the name of the island had triggered some deep, instinctive response. "Never heard of it," Jonas said, though he was watching Hope's reaction with growing concern. "Few have. According to the Admiral's notes, it's a place that exists only in legends, an island that appears to certain people at certain times, always when they're searching for something more valuable than gold." Rodrigo's scarred face grew serious. "The Spanish believed it was cursed. Ships that found it either returned with crews who spoke of miraculous healings and impossible wonders, or they never returned at all. Jonas unrolled the map, revealing intricate drawings that seemed to shift and move in the lamplight. The cartographer had used inks that caught the light strangely, making the island's outline appear three-dimensional. At the center of the landmass was drawn a massive tree, its branches reaching toward symbols that might have been stars or might have been something else entirely. "Why show this to me?" Jonas asked. "Because your monkey recognized the name. Look at him." Hope had indeed changed dramatically since hearing about the island. The playful, musical creature had become still and alert, his large eyes fixed on the map with an intensity that was almost human. His small hands reached out to touch the parchment, tracing the outline of the central tree with reverent precision. "He knows this place," Rodrigo observed. "Which means he's not just any monkey, is he? He's connected to whatever mysteries that island holds." Jonas felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Hope's mysterious origins, Mama Esperanza's cryptic warnings about ancient bloodlines, the creature's uncanny abilities during the storm. All of it pointed toward something far more significant than he'd ever imagined. "What do you propose?" Jonas asked. "A partnership. Your ship and mine, sailing together to find this island. If it truly contains treasure, we split it equally. But if it contains something else, answers perhaps, about what your monkey really is, then we learn together." The offer was tempting, but Jonas knew Rodrigo too well to trust him completely. "And if I refuse, then you sail away, and I wish you fair winds. I won't pursue you or your crew again." Rodrigo's expression grew contemplative. "Today's fights taught me something, Blackwater. There are different kinds of strength in this world. Maybe it's time I learned about some of them." Hope's whistle began again, but this melody was unlike anything Jonas had heard before. It was ancient, haunting, and filled with longing, as if the monkey was calling out to something or someone far away. The sound raised goosebumps on every man's arms and made the very air around them seem to shimmer. "He's made his choice," Rodrigo said quietly. "The question is, have you?" Jonas looked at his crew, seeing the mixture of excitement and concern in their faces. Isabella nodded slightly. She trusted his judgment, whatever he decided. Old Pete was studying the map with professional interest, his weathered hands tracing the sailing routes marked in faded ink. Sarah watched Hope with the fascination of someone who understood that they were witnessing something beyond ordinary experience. "If we do this," Jonas said finally, "we do it my way. No unnecessary violence, no harm to innocents we might encounter, and no betrayal once we reach the island." "Agreed," Rodrigo extended his massive hand. "Partners, then, at least until we discover what secrets this island holds." As they shook hands, Hope's song reached a crescendo that seemed to make the map itself glow with inner light. The ancient Spanish treasure chart had become something more, a key to mysteries that might finally explain why a dying monkey had chosen to trust a compassionate pirate, and what that choice might mean for all of them. The Caribbean stretched endlessly before them, hiding islands that existed only in legend and dreams. But with Hope as their guide, even legends might prove to be navigable waters. The island of the Guardians rose from the morning mist like a dream made solid. After 5 days of following the ancient Spanish map through waters that seemed to exist outside normal navigation, Jonas felt his breath catch as their destination materialized before them. The island was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Towering cliffs of black volcanic stone surrounded a central peak that disappeared into perpetual clouds, while beaches of silver sand stretched between hidden coves. But what caught everyone's attention was the jungle, vegetation so lush and vibrant it seemed to glow with its own inner light. "Mother of God," Rodrigo whispered from the deck of the Venganza, sailing parallel to the Mercy's End. "It's real." Hope had been agitated for the entire journey, barely eating, his whistle songs becoming increasingly complex and urgent. But now, within sight of the island, the monkey had gone completely still. He sat on Jonas's shoulder like a carved figurine, his large eyes fixed on something only he could see. Drop anchor in the bay, Jonas called to both crews. We go ashore in longboats. The landing party consisted of Jonas, Isabella, old Pete and Sarah from the Mercy's End, with Rodrigo bringing 3 of his most trusted men. Hope rode on Jonas's shoulder as they rowed toward the silver beach, his whistle producing a single sustained note that seemed to harmonize with the sound of waves against sand. The moment they stepped onto the beach, Jonas knew this place operated by different rules. The sand beneath their feet was warm despite the early morning hour, and the air carried scents that reminded him of every garden he'd ever loved, but couldn't quite identify. More disturbing, their footprints in the sand filled themselves in within moments, as if the island was erasing evidence of their presence. This way, Hope suddenly spoke, not with his whistle but with actual words in a voice like wind chimes. Everyone froze in shock except Jonas, who somehow wasn't surprised. The monkey's intelligence had always seemed more than animal. Perhaps it was time to acknowledge what he'd always suspected. "You can talk," Isabella breathed. "I could always talk," Hope replied, his voice carrying an accent that belonged to no earthly nation. But words were not necessary until now. This island responds to intention and truth, not deception. Here, all beings show their true nature. He leaped from Jonas's shoulder and began walking toward the jungle with confident steps. The vegetation parted before him as if recognizing an old friend, creating a path where none had existed moments before. "Follow," Hope instructed, "but touch nothing without permission. This island is alive in ways your minds cannot fully comprehend." The jungle was a cathedral of green light and impossible beauty. Trees grew in perfectly symmetrical spirals, their branches forming natural archways overhead. Flowers bloomed in colors that had no names, and the very air seemed to shimmer with energy that made everyone feel more alert, more alive than they'd ever been. "Look at this," Sarah called out, kneeling beside a stream that ran with water so clear it seemed like liquid crystal. "I can see every grain of sand on the bottom, but it must be 20 feet deep." Old Pete reached toward an unusual fruit hanging from a nearby tree, but stopped when Hope's sharp whistle cut through the air. "That fruit grants visions of possible futures," Hope explained, "but the knowledge comes with a price. Most minds cannot bear seeing all the paths their lives might take." They walked deeper into the island's heart, passing wonders that defied natural law, a waterfall that flowed upward into the sky, butterflies that left trails of light in their wake, and everywhere the sense of being watched by benevolent but alien intelligence. At the center of the island stood the tree from the map, but seeing it in reality made the Spanish cartographer's work seem like a child's sketch. The tree rose nearly 1,000 feet into the air, its trunk so massive that Jonas estimated it would take an hour to walk around it. Its roots created a complex network of chambers and passages, while its branches held structures that might have been buildings or might have been fruit. At the base of the great tree sat a small jade statue of a monkey, carved with such exquisite detail that it seemed ready to come to life. Hope approached the statue with reverence, placing his small hands upon its surface. "My ancestor," he said simply, "the first guardian of this place, the one who chose to bridge the gap between what was and what could be." The statue began to glow with soft green light, and suddenly Jonas understood. Hope wasn't just a monkey with unusual abilities. He was the descendant of creatures who had been charged with protecting knowledge and wisdom that the world wasn't ready to lose. "This island," Hope continued, his voice growing stronger, "exists to preserve what matters most: compassion, courage, the understanding that all life is connected. My people have guarded these truths for thousands of years, waiting for the time when the outside world would be ready to receive them." "And now?" Jonas asked. Hope turned to face the assembled group, his eyes no longer those of an animal, but of an ancient soul carrying impossible wisdom. "Now that time has come, the question is, are you ready to help me carry this knowledge back to a world that desperately needs to remember how to love?" The jade statue's glow intensified as Hope's hands remained pressed against its surface, and Jonas felt the world shift around them. The air itself seemed to thicken with ancient memories, and he found himself experiencing visions that belonged to centuries past. He saw the island as it once was, home to a civilization of beings who existed between the physical and spiritual worlds. They had been teachers, healers, and guardians of wisdom that connected all living things. But as the outside world grew more violent and greedy, these guardians had made a choice to retreat into hidden forms, preserving their knowledge until humanity was ready to receive it again. The crystal pendant, Hope said, and Jonas noticed for the first time that the monkey wore a small crystal around his neck, barely visible beneath his fur. It connects me to the island's heart, to the accumulated wisdom of my ancestors. But it also bound me to this place. When I was taken as an infant, stolen by treasure hunters who didn't understand what they had found, the separation nearly killed me. The pendant caught the light from the jade statue, revealing intricate patterns carved into the crystal that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Jonas realized this was why Hope had been dying when he found him. Not from disease or injury, but from being separated from his spiritual home. The fever, the weakness, Jonas said, understanding flooding through him. You were dying from homesickness, soul sickness. Yes, and your love, your refusal to let me die, created a bridge that sustained me until I could return. Hope's voice carried infinite gratitude. But now that I'm here, I face a choice that will determine not just my fate, but the fate of everyone who sailed with us. Rodrigo, who had been unusually quiet since Hope began speaking, stepped forward with his usual directness. What choice? Hope removed his hands from the statue, and the visions faded, leaving them once again in the ordinary, though still magical, reality of the island. I can stay here, take my place as this island's guardian, and live forever in peace and wisdom. Or I can return with you to the outside world, carrying what knowledge I can, but knowing that the separation will eventually consume me. How long would you have? Sarah asked, her healer's instincts immediately grasping the medical implications. Perhaps a year, maybe less. The crystal can sustain me for a time, but without the island's constant renewal, I would fade. Jonas felt his heart breaking. After everything they'd been through together, after proving that love could triumph over impossible odds, was he going to lose Hope anyway? There has to be another way, he said. There is, Hope replied, but his tone suggested it came with significant costs. The island could be awakened, made visible to the outside world permanently. My people could emerge from their hidden forms and share their wisdom directly with humanity. That sounds perfect, Isabella said. What's the catch? Hope gestured toward the great tree, whose branches seemed to stretch into dimensions that hurt to contemplate directly. The world isn't ready. Revealing this place now would bring treasure hunters, governments, those who would exploit rather than learn. My people would be captured, enslaved, or destroyed. The knowledge we've preserved for millennia would be corrupted or lost. So, we're back to impossible choices, old Pete observed grimly. Not impossible, Rodrigo said, surprising everyone. Difficult, but not impossible. The massive pirate captain had been studying the jade statue with an expression Jonas had never seen on his face. Something that might have been called wonder. What if we didn't reveal the island? What if we became its protectors instead? Hope's large eyes fixed on Rodrigo with interest. Explain, you said the island needs guardians. Well, we're pirates. We know how to keep secrets, how to protect what matters, how to fight when necessary. Rodrigo's scarred hands gestured encompassingly. What if some of us stayed, not to take, but to guard, to make sure that when the world is ready for your people's wisdom, they'll still be here to share it? The idea hung in the air like a challenge to everything Jonas thought he knew about life, duty and sacrifice. Give up the life he'd built to become guardian of something infinitely more important. I would need to return to the Caribbean, Jonas said slowly, working through the implications. My crew, the people who depend on me. But we could establish a rotation. Some guardians here, others maintaining our presence in the outside world. Hope's whistle song began again, but this time it was joined by other voices, sounds that seemed to come from the island itself, from the great tree, from the very air around them. Jonas realized they were hearing the voices of Hope's people, the hidden guardians responding to the possibility of a new alliance. They approve, Hope translated. They've been waiting centuries for humans who could be trusted with their secret. You've proven that such trust isn't misplaced. The crystal pendant around Hope's neck flared with brilliant light, and suddenly Jonas could see them, dozens of beings who existed in the spaces between human and animal, between physical and spiritual. They moved through the jungle like living poetry, their forms shifting between monkey, bird, dolphin, and shapes that had no earthly equivalent. Choose quickly, Hope urged. The island revealed itself to you because your need was genuine, but it won't remain visible much longer. The magic that hides this place from unworthy eyes is already reasserting itself. Jonas looked at his companions, seeing the same mixture of fear and determination in their faces that he felt in his own heart. They had come seeking adventure and found destiny instead. But some destinies, he realized, were worth embracing. The decision hung in the air like the moment before lightning strikes, when everyone knows the world is about to change, but no one knows exactly how. Then the sound of cannon fire shattered the mystical peace of the island. Ships, one of Rodrigo's men shouted, pointing toward the A where they'd anchored their vessels. Through the trees, Jonas could see black smoke rising from the direction of the beach, and his heart sank as he realized what was happening. "Cornelius Drake," he said grimly. "He followed us." More cannon shots echoed across the water, and Jonas could see that the merchant's ships, he had brought 3 of them, were methodically destroying both the Mercy's End and the Venganza. Their escape route was being eliminated with ruthless efficiency. Hope's whistle produced a sharp, urgent trill, and suddenly the hidden guardians materialized fully, their ethereal forms solidifying into creatures of terrible beauty and power. Some resembled great cats with wings of silver light, others were serpents that moved through air as easily as water, and still others defied description entirely. "They mean to take the island by force," Hope said, his voice carrying new authority. "Your merchant friend has brought soldiers, cannons, and chains. He believes he can capture my people and sell us to the highest bidder." Through the jungle came the sound of men crashing through undergrowth, their voices harsh with greed and excitement. Drake had landed a substantial force, probably planning to overwhelm any resistance through sheer numbers. "How many?" Rodrigo asked, his hand instinctively moving to where his blood-stained cutlass should have been. They had left their weapons on the boats to show respect for the sacred island. 60 men, maybe more, came a voice from the trees. Billy Thompson dropped from an overhead branch, his young face grim with bad news. "I stayed behind to watch the boats. Drake's got 3 ships and enough firepower to level half of Tortuga." Hope's crystal pendant blazed with light as the little guardian made a decision that would echo through the ages. "The island will defend itself," he announced, "but the guardians have been peaceful for too long. We need warriors who remember how to fight." He looked directly at Jonas, and in that moment the captain understood what was being asked of him. "You want us to lead them in battle. I want you to teach them what you taught your crew, that strength comes from protecting what you love, not from destroying what you fear." The sound of Drake's men grew closer, accompanied by the distinctive clink of chains and shackles. They weren't just here to loot, they were here to enslave every guardian they could capture. "Isabella," Jonas said, his voice carrying the authority of a dozen years commanding pirates, "take Sarah and Billy back toward the beach. See if you can disable some of their boats while we deal with the landing party." "I'm not leaving you to face this alone," Isabella protested. "You're not. You're making sure we have a way off this island when this is over." He pulled off his father's ring, a simple gold band that had belonged to 3 generations of Wellington merchants, and pressed it into her palm. "If something happens to me, this belongs to Hope. He's earned a place in our family." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded and began moving toward the beach with Sarah and Billy. Old Pete started to follow them, but Jonas caught his arm. "I need you here, old friend. Someone has to keep Rodrigo honest when the fighting starts. Rodrigo's laugh boomed through the jungle. Keeping me honest? That's a job for saints and fools. Good thing Pete's both. Jonas replied, surprising himself with how calm he felt despite the approaching violence. Hope leaped onto Jonas's shoulder and began playing a melody unlike anything he'd produced before. This wasn't the gentle music of healing or the warning songs of storms. This was a battle hymn that seemed to awaken something primal in everyone who heard it. The Guardians responded to the music by taking forms more suited for combat. The winged cats grew larger and more fierce, their silver wings becoming razor-sharp. The air-swimming serpents developed venomous fangs that glowed with inner fire. And from the great tree itself came new guardians, beings of wood and vine and living stone, who had slept for centuries, but were now awakening to defend their home. "Drake wants a treasure hunt," Jonas said, checking to make sure Hope's grip on his shoulder was secure. "Let's give him one he'll never forget." The first of Drake's men burst into the clearing around the great tree, their eyes wide with greed as they saw the jade statue still glowing with mystical light. Behind them came Cornelius Drake himself, his gold-toothed smile triumphant as he surveyed what he believed was his prize. "Jonas Blackwater," Drake called out cheerfully. "Thank you for leading me to the greatest treasure in the Caribbean. I'll be sure to mention your help when I sell your monkey friend to the Spanish Inquisition." Hope's whistle song reached a crescendo that seemed to make the very air vibrate with power. The battle for the island of the Guardians was about to begin, and Jonas realized that everything Hope's life, the Guardians' freedom, and the future of an ancient wisdom hung in the balance. The battle erupted with Hope's whistle song as its overture. The small Guardian leaped from Jonas's shoulder into the heart of the conflict, his crystal pendant blazing like a star as he began weaving between Drake's soldiers with impossible speed and grace. Jonas had seen Hope's abilities during the storm, but this was different. Here on his ancestral island, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the little Guardian moved like living lightning. He darted between sword strikes, his tiny hands touching pressure points that sent grown men tumbling to the ground, while his whistle produced notes that seemed to disorient and confuse the attackers. "Impossible," Drake snarled, watching his carefully planned assault dissolve into chaos. "It's just a monkey." But Hope was far from alone. The island's Guardians had taken Jonas's advice to heart. They fought not with fury but with purpose, protecting rather than destroying. The great cats with silver wings swooped down to snatch weapons from soldiers' hands rather than clawing at their flesh. The serpents of living air coiled around men's legs, tripping them into harmless tangles rather than delivering deadly bites. Jonas found himself fighting alongside creatures from legend, and he discovered that their restraint made them more effective, not less. Drake's men, trained for brutal conquest, didn't know how to respond to opponents who seemed more interested in subduing than slaughtering. "Captain," old Pete's voice cut through the melee. "Behind you." Jonas spun to find one of Drake's lieutenants raising a pistol aimed directly at Hope. Time seemed to slow as Jonas realized he was too far away to intervene, and the Guardian was too focused on his own battle to notice the threat. But Rodrigo was there instead. The massive pirate captain, fighting with nothing but his bare hands, tackled the gunman just as the weapon discharged. The shot went wild, and both men crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs and curses. "Nobody shoots the monkey," Rodrigo bellowed, his scarred face split by a grin that was equal parts savage and delighted. "He's under my protection now." The declaration seemed to rally everyone, pirates and Guardians alike. What had begun as a desperate defense transformed into something more, a coordinated effort that blended human cunning with mystical power. Hope's crystal pendant suddenly flared with such brilliance that everyone on the battlefield was forced to shield their eyes. When the light faded, the little Guardian stood atop the jade statue, his form somehow larger and more imposing despite his small size. "Enough," Hope's voice carried across the clearing with authority that belonged to ages past. "This island is protected by laws older than your civilizations. You have brought violence to a place of peace, chains to a sanctuary of freedom. The Guardians offer you one chance to leave with your lives." Drake's response was to draw a jeweled dagger and lunge toward the statue. I don't negotiate with animals. What happened next would be spoken of in whispers throughout the Caribbean for generations to come. Hope's whistle produced a single, perfect note that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequency of life itself. The sound wrapped around Drake like visible force, lifting him from the ground and holding him suspended in mid-air. "You misunderstand," Hope said, his voice now carrying harmonics that belonged to the island itself. "I am not an animal. I am what your people once were, before you forgot how to listen to the world's heartbeat. I am what you could become again, if you chose wisdom over wealth." The jade statue began to glow more brightly, and suddenly Jonas could see the truth of what Hope had become. The little guardian was no longer just a descendant of ancient protectors. He had accepted his full heritage, becoming a bridge between worlds, a living embodiment of the compassion that could heal the wounds between species. But the transformation was costing him. Jonas could see strain in every line of Hope's small body, could hear the exhaustion creeping into his voice. The power required to hold Drake suspended while protecting the island was burning through Hope's life force like fire consuming parchment. "Let him go," Jonas called out. "You've made your point." Hope's eyes met Jonas's across the battlefield, and in that gaze, the captain saw infinite gratitude mixed with infinite sorrow. The guardian was saying goodbye. "Some prices are worth paying," Hope said softly, his voice now audible only to Jonas despite the distance between them. "You taught me that when you refused to let me die in the dirt. Now let me teach you what it means to live for something greater than yourself." The crystal pendant around Hope's neck began to crack, hairline fractures spreading across its surface like a spider's web. Jonas realized with horror that Hope was preparing to sacrifice his connection to the island and his life to save everyone else. "Hope, no." Jonas started running toward the statue, but the remaining guardians moved to block his path, their eyes filled with the same terrible understanding. Their little brother was choosing to become legend, and legends once born could never be called back. Jonas broke through the line of guardians through sheer force of will and desperate love. As he ran toward the jade statue where Hope was slowly dying to save them all, he shouted the only words that mattered. "You're not alone." The declaration seemed to resonate through the island's mystical energy, and suddenly Jonas felt something shift in the air around them. The other guardians, seeing his desperate charge toward their dying brother, began to move as well. But instead of trying to stop him, they were joining him. Rodrigo's voice boomed across the battlefield. "If the monkey dies, we all die with him." Old Pete, despite his wooden leg, was hobbling as fast as he could toward the statue, his weathered face set with grim determination. Even some of Drake's soldiers, witnessing something that transcended their understanding of treasure and conquest, had stopped fighting and were staring in wonder at the small creature willing to sacrifice everything for peace. Hope's crystal pendant cracked further, each fracture sending out pulses of light that dimmed with every heartbeat. The little guardian was pouring his life force into holding Drake suspended while simultaneously shielding the island from the merchant's weapons and greed. "You don't have to do this alone," Jonas called out as he reached the base of the statue. "That's what you taught me, remember? That love is stronger when it's shared." Hope's large eyes, growing dim with exhaustion, fixed on Jonas with surprise and something that might have been hope. "I don't know how to share this burden," Hope whispered, his voice barely audible above the battle's chaos. "The power required to protect the island, to send these invaders away safely, it demands everything I have. Then let us give you everything we have." Jonas placed his hand on the jade statue and immediately felt the flow of ancient energy coursing through the carved stone. It was overwhelming, like trying to drink from a waterfall, but he held on, pouring his own life force into the mystical matrix that Hope was trying to maintain alone. Rodrigo was next, his massive hand joining Jonas's on the statue's base. "For brotherhood," he growled, his scarred face peaceful for perhaps the first time in 20 years. Old Pete arrived and added his weathered palm to theirs, "For the lad who showed us what courage really looks like." One by one, The guardians of the island joined the human circle around the statue, their ethereal forms becoming solid as they linked their power to Hope's desperate effort. The great cats with silver wings, the serpents of living air, the beings of wood and stone, all of them choosing to share the burden rather than watching their youngest brother die alone. Even some of Drake's soldiers, moved by something they couldn't name but couldn't ignore, laid down their weapons and approached the statue, not to join the mystical circle. They weren't capable of that, but to witness something that would change their understanding of what it meant to be truly wealthy. Hope's crystal pendant stopped cracking. The fractures didn't heal, but they stopped spreading, held in place by the combined will of dozens of souls who had chosen love over self-preservation. Together, Hope said, his voice growing stronger as the shared energy flowed through him, "We can send them home without harm, protect the island's secrets, and ensure that this wisdom remains safe until the world is ready." The jade statue beneath their hands began to pulse with warm light, and Jonas felt something he had never experienced before, the sensation of being part of something infinitely larger than himself, while somehow becoming more fully himself than ever before. Hope's whistle song resumed, but now it was joined by other voices. Jonas found himself humming harmonies he'd never heard, while Rodrigo's bass voice added depths that made the very ground vibrate with music. The Guardians contributed sounds that had no earthly equivalent, creating a symphony that seemed to encompass every emotion that had ever existed. The music reached Drake, still suspended in midair by Hope's power, and for the first time in his greedy life, the merchant understood what he was truly seeing. Not a treasure to be claimed, but a miracle to be preserved. Drake's voice was small, confused, like a man waking from a fever dream. "I don't understand what's happening to me. You're remembering," Hope said gently, lowering the merchant safely to the ground. "Remembering what it felt like to care about something more than gold." The circle around the statue maintained their connection as Hope worked a final miracle. Instead of destroying Drake's ships or harming his men, the little guardian simply sent them away, not through violence or force, but through a kind of loving redirection that placed them back on their vessels with only vague memories of finding an island that couldn't quite be mapped. As the last of the invaders vanished into the morning mist, Jonas felt the energy circle slowly dissolving. But something had changed permanently, not just in Hope, but in all of them. They were no longer separate beings cooperating. They had become something new, something that had never existed before. A family bound not by blood, but by choice. Not by species, but by love. 6 months after the battle for the island of the Guardians, the port of Tortuga had never seen anything quite like the celebration surrounding the Mercy's End. The ship herself bore new additions, a carved figurehead depicting Hope with his wooden whistle, crafted by the island's guardians from wood, that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Jonas stood at the bow, watching his crew prepare for another departure. But this wasn't like the desperate voyages of old, when they'd sailed seeking whatever prize might keep them afloat another month. Now they sailed with purpose, carrying medicine to plague-stricken settlements, relocating refugees from Spanish raids, and spreading a new kind of piracy, one that stole from the cruel to give to the innocent. Hope sat on his shoulder, playing the gentle melodies that had become their signature across the Caribbean. The little guardian's crystal pendant still bore the fractures from that desperate day on the island, but they had become something beautiful, lines of silver light that pulsed in harmony with his heartbeat. Captain Billy Thompson called from the rigging, his voice stronger and more confident than Jonas remembered. The boy had grown during their time as the island's protectors, learning not just seamanship, but the deeper lessons of what it meant to guard something precious. Isabella signals ready to weigh anchor. Isabella had chosen to split her time between the island and the sea, establishing the rotation system that kept both the Mercy's End operational and the Guardians protected. She commanded a crew of former Drake soldiers, men whose encounter with Hope's miracle had transformed them from treasure hunters into protectors. And Rodrigo? Jonas still arguing with the tree spirits about proper fishing techniques. Old Pete called from the galley, his laughter carrying clearly across the deck. Rodrigo had surprised everyone by choosing to spend most of his time on the island, his violent nature gradually tempered by daily exposure to beings who responded to every conflict with patient wisdom. The massive pirate had discovered an unexpected talent for teaching young guardians about the outside world, preparing them for the day when they might need to venture beyond their sanctuary. His blood-stained cutlass now hung in the great tree's branches, transformed by guardian magic into a symbol of peace rather than violence. "Time to go," Hope said, his voice carrying the authority he'd gained from accepting his full heritage. But Jonas could hear the affection beneath the formality. They had all changed during their time as guardians, but their bond had only grown stronger. As the Mercy's End cleared Tortuga's harbor, Jonas reflected on the stories that were beginning to spread through the Caribbean. Tales of pirates who healed instead of harmed, who appeared wherever suffering was greatest and vanished before proper thanks could be given. Some called them ghosts, others angels, but those who had been helped knew the truth. They were simply people who had learned to love something greater than themselves. Sarah emerged from below deck, carrying Timothy's recovered parrot on her arm. The bird's wing had healed perfectly during their time on the island, and she now served as the ship's messenger, carrying word between the various crews that had joined their cause. "Message from the Phoenix Rising," Sarah announced, reading from a small scroll tied to the parrot's leg. "Captain Martinez reports successful evacuation of the village near Portobello. Spanish raids repelled. Families relocated to safe harbors." The Phoenix Rising was one of 5 ships now operating under Jonas's guidance. Former treasure hunters and pirates who had been inspired by Hope's example to find new purpose. They formed a loose network of protectors who communicated through the island's mystical connections, coordinating their efforts across thousands of miles of ocean. "Any word from Mama Esperanza? She says the healing gardens are thriving, and 3 more islands have requested guardian protection." Hope's whistle produced a pleased trill. "Our family keeps growing." It was true. What had begun with one dying monkey and one compassionate pirate had blossomed into something that was changing the entire Caribbean, not through conquest or force, but through the simple revolutionary idea that love could be more powerful than greed. As the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Hope began playing the evening song that had become ritual aboard the Mercy's End. The melody spoke of journeys completed and new adventures beginning, of families found in the most unlikely places, and of the truth that had transformed them all. Some treasures, the music seemed to say, were worth more than gold. Some riches could only be measured in hearts changed, lives saved, and hope given to those who had lost everything. Jonas smiled, feeling the warm weight of hope on his shoulder and the loyal presence of his crew around him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new souls in need of rescue, new opportunities to prove that even in a world driven by violence and greed, love could still find a way to triumph. The carved figurehead of Hope gazed forward into the gathering darkness, her wooden eyes bright with promise, watching over all who sailed in service of something greater than themselves. 1 year after that fateful morning in Tortuga's fish market, Jonas Blackwater stood once again on the same dock where he had first found Hope dying in the dirt. But everything had changed. The morning bell of the Mercy's End rang clear and true across the harbor, no longer the cracked, desperate sound of a ship barely holding together, but the proud voice of a vessel that had found her purpose. The bell itself was new, cast by the island's guardians, and engraved with words that had become their motto: "Hope never dies." Hope perched on Jonas's shoulder, his small form no longer the fragile, fever-racked creature of memory, but a being of quiet power and infinite compassion. His crystal pendant caught the Caribbean sunrise, the silver fractures within it pulsing gently with the rhythm of a heart that had learned to love without reservation. "It seems different," Hope observed, his voice carrying the wisdom of ages, despite his diminutive size. "This place where we first found each other." Jonas nodded, studying the bustling port with eyes that had learned to see beyond surface appearances. The same merchants hawked their wares, the same sailors shared their impossible stories, but something fundamental had shifted. Acts of kindness that once would have been hidden now happened openly. Former enemies worked together. Children played with pets that might once have been abandoned to die. Stories change people, Jonas replied, and people change the world. A commotion near the fish market drew their attention. A crowd had gathered around something on the ground, and Jonas felt his heart skip as he recognized the scene. Another dying creature, another moment when the choice between compassion and convenience would define someone's character. But as they approached, Jonas saw something that filled him with more pride than any treasure ever could. A young girl no more than 10 had knelt beside an injured seabird. Her small hands moved with the same gentle determination Jonas remembered from his own desperate attempt to save Hope, while the crowd around her offered advice, encouragement and assistance instead of mockery. "That's Elena Martinez," Hope said, his whistle producing a soft, approving melody. "Captain Martinez's daughter. She's been asking her father to teach her about healing." The girl looked up as they approached, her dark eyes bright with hope and determination. "Captain Blackwater, Master Hope, can you help? I found her caught in some old fishing net, and her wing looks broken." Jonas knelt beside the child, studying the seabird with practiced eyes. The injury was serious but not fatal, much like Hope's condition had been that first day. But more importantly, he could see that Elena had already begun the most crucial part of healing. She had refused to give up. "What do you think we should do?" Jonas asked, not because he didn't know, but because he wanted to hear her answer. "Love her back to health," Elena replied without hesitation. "Just like you did with Hope." Hope leaped from Jonas's shoulder to the ground beside the injured bird, his small hands beginning the delicate work of assessment and treatment. But he wasn't working alone. Elena joined him, following his whispered instructions with the focused attention of a born healer. Around them, the crowd that had gathered grew quiet, watching another miracle unfold in the same place where the first one had begun. But this time it wasn't just one man refusing to let a creature die alone. This time it was an entire community coming together to preserve life. "She'll need careful tending for several weeks," Hope explained to Elena as they fashioned a splint for the bird's wing. "Are you prepared for that responsibility?" "Yes, Master Hope. My father says that taking care of something teaches you how to take care of yourself." Jonas smiled, hearing his own philosophy reflected in the words of the next generation. The stories that had grown from their simple act of compassion were creating ripples that would spread far beyond anything he had ever imagined. As the morning progressed, more children arrived at the dock, each bringing small acts of kindness, food for the recovering seabird, soft cloth for bedding, even tiny whistles carved in imitation of Hope's own instrument. The port of Tortuga had become a place where compassion was celebrated rather than hidden, where helping the helpless was seen as the greatest treasure of all. Hope's evening song drifted across the harbor as the sun set, but tonight it was joined by dozens of other voices, children humming along, sailors adding their own harmonies, even merchants pausing their negotiations to listen to music that spoke of hope, healing, and the unbreakable bonds between souls who choose to love. Jonas watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, each point of light a reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion could illuminate the darkness. Somewhere out there, other ships sailed under Hope's influence, carrying medicine to the sick, freedom to the enslaved, and love to those who had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for. The legend would continue to grow, but its heart would always remain the same, the simple truth that love, freely given, could transform not just individual lives, but entire worlds. Hope never died, not in the dirt of a fish market, not in the mystical energies of an ancient island, and not in the hearts of those who had learned to see treasure in the most unlikely places. And as long as there were souls willing to kneel beside the dying and whisper words of comfort, hope never would.